Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Brian Counter, and I'm joined in this episode, as always, by my co host Nathan Weinstein for another Formless one. In this episode, we discuss the coziness of survival horror games, different valences of horror and the metal genre, and American author Bennett Sims's recent short story, Portonaccio Sarcophagus. We hope you enjoy.
Have you played any of the recent Resident Evil games?
No, I'm pretty sure the last one I played, and I actually haven't played any of them at all since I want to say in high school, was Resident Evil 4.
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure that's the last one I played. I mean, I've heard plenty about them and watched some, footage or playthroughs from them, but no, I haven't.
I mean, obviously it's the classic series, and it would be fun to talk about the originals, at some point on the pod. But I've had a renaissance with the series since 2023 when I played the Resident Evil 4 remake. And around the time that was coming out, I went back and played the remakes of Resident Evil 2, which is the one that I remember most vividly from when I was a kid. I think I've talked about it in this podcast before, and Resident Evil 3. And they're really good, man. Like they're really, really polished, really fun, really well-designed games. Especially 2 and 4 are awesome models of what a remake can be, like a high def actual reimagining of the gameplay of the original, but also having tons, like pretty good faithfulness to the source material. Um, Resident Evil 8 is its own thing. There are two Resident Evil 7 and 8 that were designed to be played in first person. So that's already a big turnoff for me. And I've sort of, despite my, um, rediscovered or rekindled love for this series, I've put off playing those because it just seemed like too much of a departure. Um, and I did in fact start Resident Evil 8 using the default camera. It was on sale or whatever, so I got it and using the default camera and immediately had like a visceral dislike of the game. I just find it really jerky. I like FPS games fine, but this version just seemed really cumbersome to control, really bad feeling and bad looking in a lot of ways. Um, I feel like I may get acclimated to it, and if anyone, who's listening has experience with these first-person Resident Evils and has like, sort of strong feelings about how to make them work well or whether it's worth sticking with them, I'd love some help. But I've been playing with a third-person view that was added as part of a DLC after release. So this just makes the game control like the Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes, more or less. Um, and I've actually been having a really good time with this game. Um, and one thing it made me think of, and this could maybe circle back to our conversations about Silent Hill 2 that we've been having recently, um, is just how, like I've said this to you via text before, but just how like immensely satisfying and cozy survival horror games in this style are. Even that would include for me Silent Hill 2. So far we've talked a lot about what's uncanny, right? What's destabilizing or disorienting or upsetting about Silent Hill 2.
Yeah.
But I also my overall affect and experience of playing the game was one of like immense coziness and deep sort of like satisfaction. And that's just from the sort of meticulous spatial traversal that's sort of one of the hallmarks of the genre, meticulous spatial traversal and item collection. So on the one hand, these are games where you're seeing like incredibly upsetting things on a regular basis, and Resident Evil, it's less theoretic, conceptually upsetting or disturbing or haunting, but it's still really gory, right? People are getting cut in half or having their brains eaten or limbs severed or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but the actual experience of playing is just deeply pleasurable, even when you're scared, because at a fundamental level, you're just combing through these rooms, like immaculately conceived, exquisitely detailed rooms, often just sort of a hallmark of fine tuning, of handcrafting, and individuality. You know, um, my sense is that these games, survival horror games, like the room itself is a kind of site of uniqueness, like in Resident Evil 2, almost every room of the police station is its own thing, has its own puzzles, has its own vibe, has its own aesthetic. So like they're the exact opposite of the kind of like procedurally generated, you know, slop or whatever that many buildings in 3D games are, even in great games. You think of like Elden Ring or Skyrim where you go into these interiors and every interior looks exactly the same as another one. You know, um, the individuality and the curation of rooms in these games already feels sort of luxurious and cozy. It feels like I'm sitting down to like a delicious banquet or something where like every little item has been fussed over. Like I feel really well taken care of in that sense, even as I'm being traumatized by like bubble-headed nurses, or Pyramid Head or something.
Yeah, can I just quickly
Yeah,
ask a
please.
question? So we I think like implicitly at least when we talk about games, like you and I, but I think also just games in general because of how involved it is as a medium. There are different levels to like or different things or different aspects of a game that, you know, when you say something like this game feels cozy, that can mean a ton of different things. And you're explaining it really well, but I wonder for you, do you think that feeling kind of depends on the to a certain extent, maybe a little more than with other games? Do you think it depends on like the care that the developers specifically took to make those spaces feel specific? Or do you think it's like something else?
That's a great question. I'm just sort of formulating this in my mind right now, but I want to say that it's about the care. It's the kind of like meeting them where they've met you. I'm sorry, that's really circular. But on the one hand, there's a sense of just extreme, like loving craft and care for every one of these individual spaces. And what that engenders in the player, or rather necessitates, is a kind of equivalent care and attention to each space. So, when you're playing survival horror games, especially these sort of luxurious newer ones, but also the old PS1 games, you're so concerned about solving puzzles, about scouring the environment, paying full attention to your surroundings, picking up on environmental storytelling. There's a ton of just like awesome, really fascinating environmental storytelling going on in Silent Hill in particular. So there's so much in each individual room. They're so dense, they're so concentrated with information and gameplay sort of possibility, or if not possibility, at least like, I mean, to use a crude word, like content. There's narrative content, implicit content, and then like supplies you want to rummage and find. In no other game does finding like 3 bullets feel so damn good. Like you open a drawer and you get like 3 handgun bullets, and it's just like hell yeah. Like I know what I'm gonna count each one of those shots. I'm thinking about, every time again, like it's that same thing as like, again, not to just harp on the same, to just fall into the cliche, but like it is very Dark Souls, even though Souls games are much later, in the trajectory of the medium, like where you're survival horror games like this are forcing you to think on a granular level that you just don't normally have to in a lot of games. So items just have a kind of like sparkling significance that really is, I just find like viscerally pleasing. Like again, like finding just 3 dinky handgun bullets just feels amazing. And especially um combing through a room and finding those quite late in my process of being in that room. Like I'm like, oh, wait a minute, it looks like I can actually open this cabinet. And you open classic survival horror scenario, you open like for a an armoire or something that has like a bunch of coats, and then just sitting on the shelf in the armoire is like a box of handgun bullets, with like three bullets. It makes very little sense, but it just feels really good.
Yeah, I love that answer and that actually does. I mean, we spoke in I think one of the episodes where we were primarily talking about Elden Ring, about or at least my thought at the time was that one of the things that differentiates Elden Ring from, say, Bloodborne is that, in Bloodborne there is a real concern in terms of objects, right? There's scarcity. The fact, for example, that you have to pick up bullets means that you can eventually run out of bullets, right? I mean, you could imagine a version of Silent Hill with infinite ammo or whatever, and that would be a totally different game, and obviously would sort of ruin a lot of the suspense, but also I think like even more importantly, not just the suspense, but maybe as you're suggesting, like the atmosphere, right? Like part of that feels much more real because not every, I guess if you were actually in a scenario like that, not every package of bullets is going to be complete. You're probably going to find you're really going to have to look around and find them in odd places. And some of the places that you do find them are kind of like funny or, comical. Like they're just, in Silent Hill, there's going to be some bullets in the sink or
Right.
in a toilet or whatever, but no, I love that. I think that's a great point and a good thing to think about with specifically with that genre, I think. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that right now, but I think that's a good point to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, one last thought about this basic experience, of the genre is that the one important distinction between Resident Evil, specifically the Resident Evil remakes and I'm assuming seven, although I've only played eight in this sort of new breed of Resident Evil game. One distinction between those games and Silent Hill 2 is the way in which the game incentivizes a kind of deliberate, like s slow play, as it were. Um, Silent Hill 2 has a diegetic map, more or less. In fact, I talked a bit in one of the episodes about how it's diegetic almost to like an upsetting degree, in that in the original game, you can't read the map when you're in a dark room until you have the lantern. Um, but even in the remake, when you're looking at your map, if you once you complete a room or complete a puzzle, right, like James will actually, am I wrong? He'll like write in his map, and then when you look at the map, there'll be like a check mark or something. The key distinction then between Silent Hill and remake and Resident Evil is how the latter game and series handles the map. Because I think the stroke of brilliance for these newer Resident Evil games, truly, it just transforms my relationship to playing the series and to what it feels like to yeah, to play through these games. Is the map functions entirely non-diegetically. So you have a similar sense of ticking off things, like James is checking off clues, or well, I think he'll like X out something or check it off again if once you have completed a room's challenge. Um, that is sort of happening in Resident Evil, but it does it much differently and more abstractly. So any room you enter will show up in your map as red until you've scoured it and stripped it bare of all items, whether those be key items for progression or just pickups, like ammo or herbs or health, or any supplies. And so there's this game within a game in Resident Evil, which is almost like, I hesitate to say game within a game because in some sense for me this is the game, and like the zombie and horror are all secondary. Like in a way, the actual game of Resident Evil for me is go into a room and turn the room blue in my map because I want to make sure I've sucked like hoovered up every last little bit of content from that room. Um, and so the game is breaking immersion in a way, right? Like there's no way, this is not the protagonist is not the one who can see the map and is like would know, right? Oh, there's still a bit of ammo in this room. Like that's entirely an interface, a purely systemic interface communication from the game to the player to occasion fun, right? To occasion satisfaction that's completely extrinsic again from the experience that's being rendered within the fictional world.
Right.
And the game is breaking that immersion that is precisely to afford a kind of cozy puzzle game play, a kind of cozy satisfaction of like, again, on the surface, this is a game about traumatic experiences, about the uncanny, about the disgusting, about violence, when in fact, formally, right, at the level of what the interface is incentivizing to the player, it's a game. It's like, I mean, yeah, it's a cozy game where you walk through luxurious rooms and you just solve very easy puzzles that are not on a timer, so there's no pressure whatsoever. You can linger in a room as long as you want. And you just try to pick up little trinkets, and especially in Resident Evil, there are often these kind of little jewels, or little toys. There's a kind of miniaturism to Resident Evil that's also really it's really fitting. Like it seems again allegorical in a way of the series itself, which is a kind of like clockwork toy-like logic. And in fact, one of the concluding puzzle of Silent Hill 2, I'm just remembering remake, which you'll get to, I think, pretty soon, is a little toy box um, animatronic uh scene slash set where you're actually reconstructing narratives. I won't spoil what the narratives are about, but it involves placing dolls on this little animatronic track and arranging them so that the whole thing clicks together perfectly in sync with music. So it is again like this, yeah, it's like the video game as toy box, right? Or the video game as puzzle box. That in a way, maybe that animatronic toy puzzle is the truth of Silent Hill and not, the flesh monsters, and Pyramid Head and all this content level interest in trauma and sort of psychosexual obsession, and woundedness. It's really just the satisfaction of organizing a beautiful little music box.
Yeah, I have maybe just an errant thought that has been in my mind as I've been playing a little bit more of Silent Hill, which is that uh, I won't get too, specific because I think we are going to continue having episodes on Silent Hill, as it is a very dense game with a lot to talk about. But at times I feel like I totally hear what you're saying, but I do think that the puzzles transform the game in a way that I don't always. I mean, I guess I do like it because you know how freaked out the game has made me at certain points. So I like it in that sense as offering some kind of relief, where I feel like I can do detective work or, mathematics or something like that to distract myself from just the sheer, uh, you know, like the sheer like degradation of the atmosphere, right? I mean, just as much as you say that, the care with which the rooms in Resident Evil are rendered, it's the same with Silent Hill. These rooms are so specific, so dark, and even if there's not a plot point discussed in them or something that we find out, it still feels really lived in and maybe not the best way. Uh, and so,
Yeah.
but I also think that aesthetically having, puzzles where, for instance, there's like I think it's maybe the doctor's lounge in the hospital where you have to do one puzzle in one part of the room and then that opens up the other puzzle on the other side of the room. It just feels a little bit, I don't know, feels a little bit maybe far-fetched or it breaks my immersion a little bit. So I guess that's just kind of my thought here to push back just a little bit against that.
Yeah, no, I totally hear what you're saying, and that's the other side of the coin. I mean, you could read these puzzles as just gumming up the works, as sort of inserting friction where we didn't need friction, and often like very fantastical and goofy and video gamey friction. Like count the number of doctors in the photo. Like what does Jane like what why is that in this game, right? Like I'm sort of highlighting the productiveness and pleasure of that dissonance, but you could very well highlight the negative aspect too. And I think both are completely valid. And certainly, I mean, despite my love of this, I had moments playing the remake where I was like, okay, like I actually just really want to know what's going to happen. I really want to see the next area. I'm feeling a bit bogged down and having to like sort of attend to each of these, like as you said, like far-fetched puzzles. Um, but then my attitude would flip immediately, like so maybe I was just like I'm particularly prone to sort of oscillating between those two states. With an emphasis, I think, on just finding again like that sort of basic when I was primed for it, like that basic satisfaction playing slowly and thoughtfully, and deliberately and not, which is totally distinct from like beating the shit out of like flesh bags. But anyway, yeah, I don't want to get us sidetracked too much on Silent Hill since we'll probably talk about it more. Did you want to present your the thing you were going to talk about?
Yeah, so just briefly, so I know I kind of referred to it recently when we were talking about Silent Hill and how some of the atmosphere kind of or some aspect of it at least reminded me of the metal genre grindcore and how that genre kind of originated almost by accident, and I think actually this was about the idea of atmosphere and how in life at least atmosphere is largely accidental, especially if we're talking about weather. Um, But yeah, a few weeks ago, I went to a concert, and I'll keep this brief because I don't have, any real fully formed thoughts here, but I did want to just mention it. So I saw the band I mentioned in terms of grindcore was is a British band called Carcass, and so they played also a name that probably some listeners will know. Cannibal Corpse played, which is like a classic American death metal band, and they were just excellent. I actually haven't always really been too interested in death metal, but recently I'm starting to appreciate it a bit more. And if you don't know about death metal, I guess it's kind of what it sounds like, right? It's like really brutal. It's usually pretty kind of atonal. The chord changes and even the rhythms are just kind of hectic, and you get that classic growled, the term people use like the Cookie Monster vocals or whatever, right? You can't ever understand what people are saying, and usually the lyrics are pretty dark and gory or whatever. So, but they were great. I mean, they're just a classic, really consistent band, and it was fun to see them. But the kind of headliner, and these three bands were touring together, is a Swedish metal band called Meshuggah, and they've been around since the late 80s, and they're kind of hard to classify. Like, the kind of catch-all term you could use that would include them would be just like extreme metal. They're not death metal by any means. I mean, they have like kind of screamed vocals, but what they're doing rhythmically and compositionally is very, very different from a band like Cannibal Corpse or whatever that's kind of just doing these fast, hectic songs. Usually, what happens in Meshuggah is the drummer will oftentimes play the exact same, usually very intricate rhythm for the entire song, and the guitarist and the bassist will sort of uh, play kind of around it or over it in a different rhythm. So it's a heavily like polyrhythmic band. So like the drummer will play something, maybe, we don't have to get too too deep into like music theory or time signatures or whatever, but basically it's a band that's very rhythmically complex because there are usually three or four different sort of time signatures going on at the same time. Uh, and in addition to that, there's a real like the vocals and the lyrics are, as I said, the vocals are kind of also in this kind of screamed fashion. But the lyrics, there's a song called New Millennium Cyanide Christ, which is like the one that really stands out to me. Odd title, but basically the lyrics narrate somebody, like the speaker, I guess in the song is essentially like getting rid of all of his senses, and
Hmm.
in this like really bizarre, it's dark. I mean, you can look up the lyrics. I won't get into them, but there's something like incredibly dark about it, and the fact that it's over this like almost like mechanistic or machine-like sort of rhythm, or like a couple of rhythms that just do not change. There's no improvisation when they play live. There's no crowd banter, really. It feels very uh inhuman in a certain way that
Hmm.
feels a lot darker than something like Cannibal Corpse, even though Cannibal Corpse, one of their big famous songs or one of their classics is called Hammer Smashed Face, right? So even though Cannibal Corpse and a lot of death metal bands will have this kind of like, whatever serial killer aesthetic or this kind of, weird, just super over the top gory stuff, that feels a bit more cartoony or something. Whereas a band like Meshuggah, which uh, for me they're unique. I don't really know anyone else who's doing exactly what they did or what they do. They feel just, yeah, as I said, like kind of inhuman and really. It's like chilling actually to listen to in a good way, right? I mean, it feels to me like um, even if the subject matter is a little bit more subtle, which I guess, somebody removing all their senses through like self-surgery is not exactly subtle, but still like that feels a little more subtle than like just really kind of explicit or you know, horror-esque lyrics. I don't know if that makes sense or if that kind of comes across, but Yeah, I mean, I guess my thing here that I'm saying is that Meshuggah just kind of blew my mind, seeing them live and felt actually like a pretty at once like very exciting. I mean, it's like everybody in the crowd is kind of, banging their head to these crazy, time signatures and stuff, but also just like, thinking about it, it is like dark music, it's not like regular metal, that you would normally think of. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention that, I think it was for people who haven't listened to them, I would recommend it. They're great. Although I will say that they played some songs when I saw them that I had heard the recordings and like just didn't care for the songs, but them playing them live, and it's maybe kind of an odd thing to think of a band like this being more of a live band than a studio band, because if you think about it, it sounds more like a studio band, right? Like super complex rhythms and stuff. They might not sound as good live, but actually I think they might be like a better live band than studio. They just sounded great. And um I'll also say maybe just to end that it was maybe the first time ever that I've cared or paid attention, in a positive way to like a light show at a concert. And that's probably because of how complex their rhythms are. So the light show had multiple sort of aspects going at once. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
That's great. That's all super interesting. I actually have I expected, yeah, I don't know anything about metal. I don't know if I've ever listened to a metal song other than something you've sent me, as I guess the podcast's resident normie. Uh, but
Yep.
I have actually a thought, a somewhat in-depth, a thought that will take a little bit of explanation, and then I have two questions. And so I'm trying to organize uh my head here. Maybe I'll start with one question, which is a clarification. Um, so the band Cannibal Corpse,
Corpse.
is
Yep.
that corpse like an army corpse or
No,
army
like
corpse,
a corpse.
or like
So
like a like a like a dead body?
yeah, basically like the idea could be like like a flesh-eating zombie, I guess. So
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was, Arlie, I was imagining the first thing I thought for some reason was just like a company, like a merry company of cannibals, in some organized institutional fashion, I guess, uh, or sort of military unit of cannibals. But then a cannibal corpse as the body could be both like the object that distinguishes the cannibal, like because they eat it, so that they are what they eat, in the truest sense, but could also be the corpse of a cannibal, if the cannibals themselves are dead, or that is, if they are zombies.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Cannibal
so
corpse or cannibal's corpse with like
exactly,
the possessive S. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Um, I'll say my question for last because it's my other question because it's a bit more in the weeds with the music, but maybe on the subject of just paradox, and double meaning. I was struck by what you said about how like there is this, of course, this incredibly like sort of disturbing over the top sort of scenario you're describing where a person is depriving themselves of their senses. I'm assuming violently. Um, and you were saying like it's actually weirdly, what did you say? It's like weirdly like inhuman or abstract or something, or like quiet, even though it's like flagrantly violent and upsetting. Is it, what was the word that you used? The contrast with the kind of like visceral violence of,
Well,
yeah,
so a band like Cannibal Corpse, I mean, their songs are, they've been like at the center of a lot of controversies and stuff because they have songs that are depicting all sorts of like, criminal, violent actions, right? And they're really, I mean, they're narrated, Cannibal Corpse is great. I mean, I think if you can get past like how stupid the lyrics are, it's just it is kind of like this weird, violent fantasy music, like musically they're amazing. The singer's great. He's also maybe just a little kind of side note, the singer of Cannibal Corpse is like has is well known for just being a really nice guy. Like he's this huge guy with really long hair uh and he goes like he loves this is a well-known fact, and there are videos where he's actually on site doing this. He loves just going to Target and getting deals on stuff. So so like like I think famously out of a lot of like different types of music that are violent or explicit or whatever, death metal actually has like the most nerds in it, if that makes sense. Like it's
sure,
people who
yeah,
just clearly like I'm sure a lot of them like video games, a lot of them like horror, Lovecraft or whatever, but also just, comic books and stuff. Like these are incredibly skilled musicians. I mean, these guys could play classical music, like they to be able to play what they play is just quite astounding. And Meshuggah, on the other hand, same thing is true. These guys, especially for me, the drummer. I mean, the drummer can just play the same exact beat, which I mentioned that the music itself has sort of polyrhythms where like maybe the drummer's playing in one time signature and the guitarists are playing in another one. But there are also songs where the drummer is playing in multiple time signatures at once with his different limbs, which is, very difficult to do as a drummer.
Yeah.
So metal is like as meat-headed as it can be. It's a very technical sort of genre. But I guess what I'm saying is like what differentiates them aesthetically, I guess to go back to that term, is that Meshuggah has this kind of um, what's the word? I mean, it's not I'm gonna kill you sort of stuff, which is what a lot of death metal is, right? Or like, I'm eating a corpse, or my band is Cannibal Corpse. Meshuggah is a lot more kind of coded with these I don't know, there's maybe like almost an occult, not occult in terms of because they're also like metal bands that are kind of into like just like really legible occult stuff or whatever, and that's a whole different question. But the song I was describing, yeah, like I mean, like it narrates somebody who's like, yeah, sewing his mouth shut so he does not speak, and like using whatever acid to like burn his ears away so he does not hear, and like to be purified of the world and stuff like that, which to me feels just, I mean, yeah, it's very violent and disturbing, but it feels a lot more abstract, and maybe that's partly it actually might link up nicely with the next thing we're going to talk about, but it feels a bit more lastingly disturbing and thought-provoking in that way.
Yeah, it links up perfectly actually. And no, I want that was the detail that I wanted to just say ask, a few more follow-ups on because one thing I think you're right. Like it seems like a contradiction that this incredibly violent scenario and disturbing scenario could be actually more abstract than these other lyrics, like dark lyrics about like eating a corpse or whatever. Um, I guess we're now a horror podcast, by the way. But actually it's like it's maybe a paradox or a contradiction, but it's one that does make sense, right? Because like and you see this very vividly in the work of someone like Samuel Beckett, because Beckett's work is so much about sensory deprivation, especially his late prose stories, where characters are immobilized, right? They're often maimed or injured or in the process of losing all their senses. And often the kind of visible or bodily signs of that deprivation are quite upsetting and disturbing. But as readers, the actual experience of those texts is a move toward increasing abstraction precisely because as you're cutting away senses, you're losing sort of ways of registering physical reality, including the sort of physical reality of your own body that you're paradoxically destroying. And so it does strike me that like the endpoint of sensory deprivation is abstraction. And that you see that in Beckett on the level of the prose, and you also see it at the level of content. So I just wanted to make that connection first. I mean, the other thing I was going to say is that in just off what you just told me, like this sort of tension, but maybe not so much tension, like this dialectic between incredibly explicit, like disturbed content and a kind of like essential friendliness, or comfortability, or even coziness as a through line between what I was describing in Resident Evil and Silent Hill and what you're describing, like with this guy who like sings about this like deeply, deeply fucked up stuff and then posts videos of him going to Target and finding deals. That it's actually a perfect it's like a perfect companion to what I'm describing in Resident Evil. Again, even down to the point of like it's about thriftiness and finding creature comforts and material objects that you can take home with you. That's exactly what I'm doing and that's where I'm finding so much pleasure in the Resident Evil games, and also in Silent Hill. And I want to say this is baked in to, I mean, well, if not baked into the medium and the genre, like it's just a kind of interestingly recurring dialectic in like really, really dark material. I think it goes hand in hand with the way in which, and I taught a whole class on this year at the University of Utah, but the way in which incredibly disturbing, viscerally violent, upsetting, traumatic, problematic content so often is used as a vehicle for just formal expertise and sort of like immaculate, thoughtful construction of art. So the way you're describing like these musicians being like, classically trained musicians basically, or musicians able to sort of perform in complex polyrhythms live, like that's incredible. That the technical mastery required there is so great. Um, and so in one sense, like part of the experience of this work, again, very similar to like what I'm sort of taking great pleasure in Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil, is this purely formal beauty or accomplishment or technical mastery, that's used for the most like sometimes just like the stupidest shit. Like Resident Evil 8 is just like an immensely stupid game. Even by Resident Evil standards, like it makes Resident Evil 4 look like James Joyce. Really, like the character you play is just a blubbering idiot. The scenarios you find yourself in are so far-fetched and so silly. The dialogue is not even like cheesy B-movie one-liners like you have in the older games. It's just like brain dead dialogue. And yet again, we have really powerful, really technically accomplished work at every level of the game itself as an artifact.
Yeah, Nathan, that was all great. And I especially just before we do transition into our next topic or our next text, I think this kind of what you're touching on in terms of like a horrifying content being linked to this kind of, insight or experiment with form is especially relevant. And I think that in the story that I'll be talking about or will discuss in a minute, I also think that it highlights something pretty essential about horror where what is horrifying is something formal or rather an aberration in form, or maybe like even not strict formlessness, but something that's a little bit off about the form. So I want to introduce, I guess, the text that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about, which is a story originally published in 2022 in the Georgia Review by Bennett Sims called Portonaccio Sarcophagus. And it's collected in his 2023 book of stories called Other Minds and Other Stories. Um, and I mean, it's difficult to summarize, I guess, to give or to attempt to give a summary. It's essentially a sort of monologue where the narrator is at the Palazzo Massimo in Rome, looking at the titular sarcophagus, the Portonaccio sarcophagus, which is from second century. It's a Roman sarcophagus, and eventually, it's engraved with this kind of battle scene, right, between the Romans and some barbarians, I guess. And what he sort of notices, and what's kind of the first, moment of recognition or moment of inquiry in the story is that he notices that whoever's tomb this is, or whoever, is buried in this sarcophagus, his face and also I believe it's his wife's face have no features. So this is an incredibly detailed. I mean, you can go and look it up, and even in the story, we have one photograph, one image of the sarcophagus, and then we have sort of detail a couple pages later. You can see that this is true, right? So everything, there are these folds on all the robes of everybody. There's this kind of violence happening. There's this entire sort of battle scene that's playing out, and yet, what you would think would be kind of the key factor, right, or the key um, aspect of somebody's sarcophagus is totally blank. So who is dead and who is inside of this sarcophagus has no features, right? In this kind of yeah, it kind of prompts a whole s sliding, shifting, associative, meditation that takes place within one long, unbroken paragraph about the meaning of the face, the connection of the face to identity and death. It also takes us through a number of philosophical and, I guess, popular culture references until it gets personal, right? Near the end, we start hearing about the narrator's mother and how she is suffering from dementia, memory loss, and we kind of end in a really intriguing place. But before I say any more about it, at least, Nathan, I know this is your first time reading this story. What were your initial impressions?
I just love the story. My mind is honestly pretty blown by it, and it's one of my favorite things that I've read just point blank and full stop in recent memory. I do want to make backtrack for a second for a little bit more context because I'm not super familiar with Bennett Sims. I've only read the author Bennett Sims. I've only read this story and the postcards so far, although I'm definitely going to go back and read the rest of this collection because I've really loved both of the pieces that we've read of it. Um, my first thought is like, okay, this is a pretty like vulgar or whatever, like baseline observation or question, but it reads like an essay, that this is it's a sort of philosophical meditation on a piece of art, which is a quite classic genre of essay, of course.
Yeah.
And it's contained in a book of stories, right? So do you have any sense of like what the fictionality of this work is? Is it deliberately borrowing the form of the scholarly or philosophical essay for characterological ends, or is this a kind of autofiction, or is it supposed to be ambiguous? I mean, just within the context of Sims's work and the collection as a whole.
Yeah, so yeah, I kind of have a lot to say here. So as I think I mentioned, several episodes back, I did have an opportunity to interview Sims, and I've, been kind of corresponding with him, and uh, I asked him this question specifically. So we have four images in the story. So there's the sarcophagus, and then a detail of the sarcophagus, and then we get a photograph of the narrator's mother with this kind of weird, kind of Grim Reaper type figure, and then we get a detail of that zooms in a little bit closer to that odd figure. And so I asked him about. I sort of it was maybe not the most direct question, but I think I kind of expected this. He sidestepped it a little bit, so I think he didn't want to, or I don't know. I won't speak for him, but he maybe skillfully left some of this indeterminate. But um, in terms of what his fictional project is, which is maybe a good place to kind of get into it a little bit, he mentioned this phrase that he uses that he terms fictions of consciousness.
Hmm.
And so I like that phrase a lot. I do feel like it's an interesting phrase because it feels like maybe your initial response might be like what fiction is not a fiction of consciousness, but I do think that what he does with this idea is pretty unique. So he says this, and this is not only what he writes, but also what he's interested in as reading material or influences. Um, so he says fictions of consciousness are basically texts that are interested in the interiority or the minds of its characters and that dramatizes the movements of those minds. That's a quotation from him. So that's what he said when I asked him. And so like, you've read this story and the postcard, two very different forms, right? I mean, this is a long block text, whereas the postcard is um, every sentence is its own sort of paragraph, basically. It's written in a very different style. One thing that is, I think, kind of goes across all of his fiction is that his characters are, I mean, this maybe isn't super relevant to our discussion here, but his narrators and characters tend to be very intelligent, but in a way that I don't know that I've seen exactly written in this way before. And so we do. I mean, what happens usually is this kind of zoomed in perspective that that, there's not much objective action happening throughout any of these stories. It's usually more of a uh, the twists and turns of thought and thinking, and as we see in this story, association, right? I mean, you could imagine associatively writing an essay that covers all these different topics, but fictionally and narratively, what we're kind of meant to imagine here in the ride that we're along for is this, this character who, um, while he's on some kind of fellowship or whatever in Rome as an artist or some kind of residency or whatever, is looking at this sarcophagus and then just kind of like realizes or notices this facelessness, and that leads him on this whole path of different kind of, seemingly sort of accidental associations that kind of come together, when we read through them.
Mm. Yeah, I want to pick up on that idea of fictions of consciousness for
Sure.
a moment, if that's okay, because it's a great phrase. It strikes me as a great phrase because there are two ways. Again, we talked about two ways of understanding, Cannibal Corpse. And there are two ways of understanding fictions of consciousness. One would be fictions about consciousness, which seems to accord with what you're describing what you're saying his description of the genre or of the mode would be.
Mhm.
But you could also understand fictions of consciousness as being not fictions about consciousness, but specifically fictional or impossible movements of consciousness.
Mhm.
And I sort of feel like that's also what this story is exploring. And so I have like a kind of, I can just sort of like talk through my scattered sort of reading initial, and this is just I literally just read this over coffee an hour ago. So
Yep.
I'm really looking forward to going back and digging through the story at length. I'm definitely going to be returning to it often, I think, in the near future.
Mhm.
But for me, the hook of the story, the real hinge that turned it from like an interesting sort of philosophical essay to like again one of my favorite things I've read in a while, is when he moves from this Roman sarcophagus to the 2002, I think, film The Ring. So this actually becomes, I want to say, like quantitatively, this is more an essay and story about the ring than it is about the sarcophagus. And again, for Sims, like or Sims's narrator, this movie is kind of a it's a trashy sort of horror movie. I mean, it's a very, to my mind, it's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest horror movies ever made. But a mass market, right, horror movie about a videotape that melts people's faces.
Yep.
Becomes the perfect companion to this exquisite work of Roman craftsmanship, So again, we have that combination of like the vulgar and the disgusting, the in your face, like pun intended, because it's about the sort of destruction and melting of faces or sensory deprivation, in the metal song you're describing, and a kind of like achievement of cultivated culture, right? Like of a kind of apogee of fine art and craft. And for Sims's narrator, The Ring is a work of like philosophical brilliance in some ways. And the reason why The Ring is so striking, the film, is that there's this, and I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but I was traumatized by this movie as a seventh grader. I think about it every year. Like I love it. I've seen it, rewatched it a few times since. But I'd forgotten this detail somehow, which is that in the ring, so you characters, I'm sure most listeners know, but there's a cursed videotape where if you watch it, you are told you then receive a phone call that tells you have 7 days to live afterwards, and then 7 days later, you're murdered by this ghost who literally scares you to death and melts your face, basically, or distorts your face. Um, and the detail that Sims's narrator fixes on is that just as in on the sarcophagus, the husband and wife have these egg faces, so totally featureless, smooth faces, in contradistinction to everybody else who's rendered. Um, in The Ring, once you've watched the video, if you appear in a photo, if someone takes a photograph of you, your face is sort of melted or blurred out. So it becomes it's sort of like fuzzed out in a sort of camera glitch. And there's this great moment, like halfway through the essay, where it becomes a kind of rewriting or counterpoint to Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. So the narrator says, like, what's really powerful about The Ring, and this device and this sort of conceit that the your face starts to blur in photographs of you is that it reverses the sort of ontology and temporality, the normal temporality and ontology of a photograph.
Mhm.
So like, and there's a part that seems to be a deliberate sort of just echo of Barthes, actually,
Yep.
where Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida is writing about the sort of hauntingness of a photograph where you look at it and realize that the person is dead or is going to die. Any photograph seems to be already a photograph of that person's death or to contain that person's death within its own world. Um, and so you could say that like every photograph is a corpse in a way.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and I'll just say too, I mean, it's also Bart is talking about a photograph of his mother, and it's like crucially the one photograph that he doesn't give us in the
right,
book. So also relevant to, how this story plays out.
right. And for Sims, on the other hand, what he's or the narrator points out that in The Ring, the photograph functions as a sign of the future. So it's less this sort of emblem of death and more of it's or less a frozen moment of the past than a weirdly frozen proleptic moment of the future. Because the distortion, the glitch is emanating from a moment beyond when the photograph is being taken, right? Like somehow the camera knows that that person is fated to die and will die in 7 days or how many days they have left. Um, and I'm going to try to sort of land the plane here because the what this reminded me of is actually like, and going back to fictions of consciousness, is like the kind of fundamental glitch of narrative itself. So this is something that the narrative theorist Catherine Hamburger, that's her real name, writes about it. I think it's called The Logic of Literature, a book from the 1960s. Um, and she has this point, that very, very extremely simple point, that the past tense in narrative is a contradiction. It makes no sense because we experience the past in narrative, and I just mean the literal past tense, like once upon a time there was a woman who lived in a forest, as a present. When we're reading it, we see that as present, even though it's grammatically represented to us as past. And the fact that novelists, right, or narratives treat this past as present is proven often by the use of deictic phrases, referential phrases such as the phrase tomorrow. So for Catherine, for sorry, her name's Kate. Kate Hamburger's most famous example is the sentence "Tomorrow was Christmas." I talk about this in my classes all the time. Only in a novel can you have the phrase "tomorrow was Christmas," i.e., a tomorrow being projected and represented in the past tense. We would never speak that or even think that now. That itself is a fiction of consciousness, right? To think we would never th go around thinking tomorrow was Christmas. We would think tomorrow is Christmas or tomorrow will be Christmas.
Right.
Um, and it struck me that that exact formulation, more or less, occurs multiple times in this story. So the first sentence or second sentence of the story, the first one is the first sentence in the Palazzo Massimo Museum in Rome. I visited the small dark room where the Portonaccio sarcophagus is kept, period. Second sentence. It was my last day in the city after a year at the academy, and tomorrow I would be returning home. So the idea, I mean, again, we have the sense of like it's would be, right? It's not was, but it's a similar, I feel like it carries a similar idea of grammatical pastness, even though we're registering a tomorrow. Um, and so we have a similar kind of like, I don't know if it's the same or if it's the opposite, but it's a similar instability between futurity and pastness, right? The representation of futurity through the past, or rather like the incursion of futurity into the past tense. And just one more example of this, and then I'll stop talking. This happens in a more telling way, I think, on page 86. So this is toward the end of the story when he's talking about his mother, and he's talking about this sort of ghostly face that appears in that photograph of the narrator's mother um, and is struck by the fact that it's kind of fun to joke about it today in the sort of fictional present of the memory, because it's actually a past tense memory within the sort of timeline of the story, which is happening, seems to be emanating from the moment when he's sitting in the museum exhibit. Um, but the narrator says, even if she died tomorrow, I thought, before I flew home, her death would not make me view the photograph any differently. She would not die tomorrow. And that again is like it's a sentence that could only occur in literature, right? She would not die tomorrow.
Right.
Um, it's not you in the moment, one consciously wouldn't think that or would be really contorting their own grammar and language to think something like that. And so the story itself, in some level, like on a formal level, is playing with that idea of like, is this future, is this past? Are we accessing the future from the past, or are we giving a sort of virtual past within the future or the present? I don't know. I'm sort of confusing myself now. But I just want to underscore like the odd, like, and quite sort of unstable and even sort of low-key glitchy temporality of narrative here that's being sort of channeled into this story or played upon in the story that's also dealing with similar glitches between futurity and pastness. Even to the point of like the suggestion made by one bystander or other visitor to the exhibit in the story that like, oh, maybe these faces on the sarcophagus are blank because the sarcophagus was made as a kind of universal or future-oriented work that could then be revised once sold to depict the face of whoever is the patron or the purchaser of the sarcophagus. So there's a kind of commercial logic there too that like um, it's a representation of death, but one created before the death has been both before the death has been sort of confirmed and made real, but also before the identity of the person themselves who will inhabit the sarcophagus has been made real or confirmed, or even selected. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling now, but I
No,
was really, really struck by this sort of complex of, yeah, temporality, paradox, and then the image as well.
yeah, no, I mean, I'll just say first of all that I'm really glad we're reading this together and talking about it because yeah, I think I'm it doesn't surprise me, but I'm happy that this is prompting all these kind of thoughts in you. And I guess yeah, I hadn't really thought about this as more essayistic, but it does make a lot of sense because in my own kind of correspondence with Sims, I know that he teaches literature courses and uh some of his so I guess stylistically this big block paragraph, which is something he does in several stories. There are a few in this collection that have the same form, and I believe in his previous collection there are a couple as well. Uh, that's I know that's inspired by the Austrian novelist Thomas Bernhard, whose woodcutters I really love, and I think we should discuss at some point. I know Sims, thinks about that text a lot. Uh, the images, of course, especially this kind of, fictionalized but kind of still held in abeyance in terms of how true or fictional it is. Those images that are included, I think have some link to Sebald, who I know Sims also reads and teaches as well. But also this kind of essayistic nature. This is how I think about Borges a lot, and we've talked about Borges a bit. Not all of his stories, but some of them uh, do feel essayistic in the sense that oftentimes in his short stories, he's essentially giving us the history of a situation or the history of for instance, the Library of Babel or the history of the lottery in Babylon, uh, where there's not any action in the present tense, but there is this kind of weird thing that happens with tense. There are still moments where we look backward, we look forward, we have this kind of impossible moment. And there's a moment at the end that I do want to talk about in this story that I think, does a similar gesture that Borges does in a couple of stories as well. But one other thing, I wonder what you think about this because I'll pose this maybe as a question or maybe just an observation that I've had about Sims's work as a whole, especially after rereading his stories several times, at least a number of them, and also teaching them, is that um, the sense I get or the feeling I have, and this is what makes his work so compelling, but also very difficult because I have written a little bit about it, but I don't know if I did it justice. The sense I get when I'm reading him is that I mentioned earlier that his narrators feel very intelligent, but it's not the sort of, and I did discuss this a little bit with him in the interview, but it's not the sort of precocious, like for instance, Hal Incandenza in Infinite Jest, who's this kind of like brilliant, uh, tennis prodigy who's also very intelligent and all this stuff. It's not quite that, we don't quite get just a vision. Like there is anxiety in a lot of these stories, and I'm not sure that we've gotten to it in this story yet, but if you read some of the rest of the collection, there's certainly these kind of spiraling thought patterns,
Hmm.
especially with house sitting. I think that's something that happens in a really intriguing way. But what I feel like the effect is in a story like this is that we get uh, a whole bunch of really interesting thoughts and ideas and connections, but we also already in advance kind of get their interpretation. So it's like, we can make connections back to things that we've read or ideas that we've had, and we can see the interpretations or the links as they're happening, but it also kind of almost feels like it forecloses some of that for us because there's maybe not the space for us to make those on their own, which I mean, I don't think this is necessarily a horror story, right? I mean, he does write some stuff that you could classify as horror, but it's not horror in any kind of normal sense that we would usually think of. But if there is a horror, I think it's maybe like a sort of interpretive or I mean maybe even like the concert I was talking about, right? It's like the difference between like formal horror, which actually, the content is disturbing or can be uncanny or can be kind of unsettling, but it's actually the form and the connections and the sort of path that it leads the narrator on, but also the way that that path kind of frustrates our attempts to maybe get out of it or maybe do something with it. Like it feels hard to do something with this precisely because the narrator is already doing a lot of it, right? It's doing a lot of it for us or doing a lot of it despite us or however we want to think of it.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. I mean, it's similar maybe to someone like Kafka. Kafka, I was thinking of Kafka reading the
Mhm.
postcard, and so maybe that's something to discuss down the line.
Yeah.
But where there's both sort of it's not that the characters are intellectualized, quite the opposite. Actually, what reminded me of Kafka in the postcard is that the protagonist at the end of the story like falls asleep or wants to sleep, which is something that happens in Kafka. Like it's like the characters are inexplicably tired, and it seems like the most momentous events of their lives are unfolding, and these uncanny events are unfolding at the moment as we're reading, and the character just keeps talking about how they want to fall asleep.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an actual, it's again a kind of sensory deprivation or mental deprivation, that maybe links it to Beckett, links it to the song that you were describing before.
Yeah.
Um, but in Kafka, there are a lot of ideas, right? And there's a kind of allegorical energy, but also the Kafka stories are constantly interpreting themselves. Like characters will then give interpretations of the symbols that seem to be in the stories, and that kind of has the effect of just jamming the signal of interpretation itself.
Mhm.
It's like, well, how can I do a symbolic reading of the trial when the novel has already supplied like 10 different interpretations, like diegetically of like what the trial could mean, what the law is.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
And this is what
yeah,
makes Kafka so difficult, right?
exactly.
There's like
But I
no.
wonder if we could, I mean, just throw another term out there. Like, I
Yeah.
wonder if the horror of abstraction is a useful category for us. Um, because in a sense, this seems to me unequivocally a horror story. I mean, again, like it's literally about faceless, like you know, featureless bubbleheads, eggheads, like in Silent Hill or in some folk tales, horror folk tales, on the sarcophagus. It's about a sarcophagus, and then it's about a kind of Grim Reaper apparition glitch appearing in a photograph. I mean, these are like, in a way, these are like fundamental, generically charged objects for horror.
Hmm.
And yet, despite that kind of like basic horror content, what they're used for is this kind of abstract meditation, you know? Um, and so on the one hand, like the faceless figures on the sarcophagus do gesture again toward this theme, I guess, of our conversation today, like of sensory deprivation, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but they have that doubleness, where like sensory deprivation or destruction, right, is at once content that seems quite ripe, even tropey for horror, but it also has this kind of abstracting effect phenomenologically or experientially, in the work again of, I think we would include Sims in this list, but also Kafka, I think, definitely also Samuel Beckett's late work,
Yeah.
where it's precisely the sort of deprivation or occlusion of the senses or just like mental capacities that jars with the kind of horrifying scenarios that are happening. I don't even know what I want to say about it, but it has a very particular flavor, right? It does create this kind of strangely neutral quality out of the most non-neutral material. Like it's hard to think of a less neutral object or phenomenon than seeing a picture of your mother, whether fictional or not, in which there seems to be a dark figure lurking behind her shoulder,
Right.
right? That's not a neutral scenario. That's a horror scenario. But what the abstraction or theorization or conception on the conceptual level, like it becomes weirdly neutral, you know,
Yeah,
through its treatment. Yeah,
because
yeah, go ahead.
he says that the photograph doesn't haunt her, but rather is will have been haunted by her death, right? So I guess just to maybe like interject and pick up on this, yeah, I think I do think you're right. I'll take back what I said. This is a horror story, but I guess the complication is that there's nothing, like that we could deem horrific that happens in the story. Like we could imagine a story where, there's this kind of weird glitch in the photograph uh and then something happens to his mother, but not only does that not happen, but our narrator acknowledges that possibility and then kind of like refutes it, right? I mean that's what I mean. It's almost like it's horror, but it's like it's reacting maybe even in like a meta generic sense, but also in just in purely narrative terms, it's reacting against those tropes that would make this into a more legible horror story. And I do think this is what, this is, I will say, like the brilliance of Sims's writing. This is what he does across this collection and his previous collection. He does this frequently where, uh, and this is, again, a term that's been on my mind a lot as well as and I'll just kind of use it loosely, but like virtuality or, this kind of idea that um, maybe we're thinking about these structures, and as readers, I think like what is a genre can, the idea of a genre or a certain outcome for a story that we might expect can be maybe put in those terms, like, maybe, virtually this could have been a
Yeah.
horror story, but instead we have this other thing that still can exist within that fictional space, but in a way makes it more horrific, right? The abstraction makes it uh, maybe like some of the gestures that occur and some of the atmosphere that happens in Silent Hill makes it actually like more disturbing, right?
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is like we can again turn what you just said back, turn what you just said on its head in that if we conceive of the virtual or the fictional as like, as the unreal, that could be, Gothic tropes, horror tropes could slot neatly into that. And the brilliance of this story is that it ultimately ends in a place where all of that tropey stuff is pales in comparison to the true horror story, which is dementia.
Hmm.
That like this is itself ultimately on a quite literal level a story about a mother, losing her mental capacities, losing her capacity for recognition, such that, and this is the kind of hinge of the story, is that the
Yeah.
narrator imagines that his mother now sees everybody as faceless because she can't remember them.
Yeah, and that's like the unknowable thing, I guess, right? It's not something from another world, but it's something from within this world, and not only that, but from within the family that's just kind of like a void, right? Or a blank.
Exactly. And I mean, and tell me, I mean, like you can't convince me that like having my face melted or seeing the melted face of a corpse, a la The Ring is even holds a candle to the terror of dementia. Like just straight up. Um and that turn is itself like I'm just sort of processing this now as another uh direction that stories, genre stories, horror stories can take. It just reminds me, I'll just say really quickly in passing, of another one of my favorite games ever. I think I've mentioned it in the podcast before, Returnal from 2021, Housemarque's bullet hell shooter, time loop shooter. So I'm gonna majorly spoil the ending of Returnal here. So be warned, like spoilers or whatever. Returnal is a game set on an alien planet where you play as an astronaut and you're stuck in a time loop and you keep waking up and traverse this sort of procedurally generated planet, like fighting. It's incredibly difficult. It's like a mean ass game, shooting monsters with lasers. And when you reach the end of the game, you learn like it's incredibly gamified, right? It's a sort of like it's life as a game, sci-fi as a game because you're on this eternally recurrent cycle of dying and respawning. Um, you learn that it's really a game. It's implied heavily that it's really a game about a car crash. And it's like what for me that the sort of juxtaposition and jump and leap there from like this sort of trope influenced horror, eldritch horror. It's also very Lovecraftian. Eldritch horror, sci-fi, right? Fighting these faceless, unknowable beings who are warping time and space, like segues suddenly and shockingly into the imagery just of a car lying at the bottom of a river. And there's like I've said this on record, but like in one of my pieces, but like there's nothing more eldritch than the sight of a car's headlights, shining underwater. Partly because it's like the headlights would only be on if the car was driving before it landed in the water, you know. But it's like it's an incredibly chilling image, and it's basically what the game ends on. So again, it's like nothing's more fucked up, more scary, more destructive of your sense of self and time and bearing and orientation in the world than a car crash, where a loved one dies,
Mhm.
potentially, than any of this eldritch stuff, or maybe they're actually the same thing or about the same thing.
Yeah, I think that that's a great it's yeah, that's an interesting point that I'm gonna have to think about more. I mean, I want to just say a couple more things about the story. Um, that it was interesting, and I'm glad I kind of brought it up in the interview because this is a reaction I had sort of after kind of rereading this story a few times, and then also I had been, teaching Borges in a couple of my classes, so I was thinking a lot about Borges and just how to deal with what he does, I guess, in his short stories. But there are two moments that seem to really, you know, resonate with things that Borges does in different stories. But I was thinking specifically about the Aleph,
Mhm.
which is a story about, there's a whole backstory, but essentially the key point is that this guy, the narrator, visits this kind of his rival, I suppose you could say, and like in his rival's sort of basement, under the basement staircase, there's the Aleph, which is like a point which contains all points in the universe, and so
Mhm.
he can see everything, right? But there's this real question of, what does it mean to actually see everything, right? And this is a question that in a certain way I think Sims brings up in a maybe more minor point here narratively, but I think it kind of has the same weight, which is uh, the question of simultaneity versus succession. So
Mhm.
early in the story, when the narrator's looking at the sarcophagus, he kind of wonders like, so this many lines of these carved figures who are doing battle, is each line a different, you know, stage of the battle, or is this all actually happening at the same time, right? Am I looking at this simultaneously, and am I supposed to understand that this chaos is all happening at the same time in a way that I maybe visually or even mentally can't, comprehend, or is it just simply succession that has to be rendered kind of all at once because of the medium, right? And this is, of course, like what Kant talks about in the Analytic of the Sublime, right? This is the question between the split between what we can apprehend or perceive based on sheer magnitude, and and so in fiction, we have to have things in succession, right? I mean, this is maybe in a different angle, going back to your point about tense, right? Or temporality or whatever. But even just the words on the page as a reader, I have to even if I'm getting a description of everything happening all at once, I have to read it, in succession, right? And so the moment where the narrator of the Aleph looks into the Aleph and sees everything, right? He has to narrate this whole long list that goes on for, several lines, right? Where really we're supposed to understand that he's kind of experiencing all these things at the same time, right? Which is impossible to really represent, right? So it's something unrepresentable. Um, but another thing that happens, and this is something that Sims mentioned when I brought that up. This happens at the very end of Portonaccio Sarcophagus. This also happens in the Library of Babel. So it happens in the Aleph and the Library of Babel, and I'm sure it probably happens in other Borges stories, but it's a moment. There's something similar that happens at the end of Portonaccio Sarcophagus. So maybe I'll just read the last few lines. And this is where the story ends. So I'll just read to the end of the story. But this is also when the narrator is anticipating, so again, just to be clear, like this whole story takes place. He's just sitting there looking at the sarcophagus and everything that's happening is just his thoughts, right? So there's nothing has actually happened. He's just sitting there going through these different associations. And I will also just note that one of those associations is a Goosebumps book, which I think is a nice touch, right? Which gives another little angle to the specificity of this intelligent narrator is that, as you mentioned, Nathan, like he's not afraid to bring the Ring into this, as well as Nietzsche and Levinas and these other kind of deeper references to Roland Barthes, which I think you're totally right. But yeah, he also like maybe is remembering a Goosebumps book that he read as a kid, as I did, and maybe you did as well. But
For
anyway,
sure.
he's anticipating going to get picked up at the airport after his flight back from Rome. And he's talking about his mother. He's just gone through this entire thing where he's talking about Google Street View, I think, and how, he kind of has the realization that, when you see people on Google Street View, they have their faces blurred. And so maybe that's how his mother experiences the world, because part of dementia is not recognizing people precisely through their faces, even your close family. And that's, one of the threads that ties together the story. So he's talking about being picked up. He says they would be picking me up from the airport tomorrow, and our mother would be with them. He's referring, them is his sisters. It had been over a year since she had seen me in person. I expected her still to recognize me, and if she didn't, if she failed at first to place me, at least I will have known by the confusion in her eyes something of what she was seeing as she watched her daughters embrace this stranger as he turned to introduce himself and did his best to compose my face. So there's this kind of weird like slip between, the third and the first person here. Uh,
Mhm.
and the way Borges does this is a little bit different, right? So like there's moments in both the Aleph and Library of Babel where he goes into the second person, and what Sims kind of suggested is that those moments in Borges break the story open and make it actually like less claustrophobic, because in Borges, I think similarly Borges is difficult to write about or think about because he seems to be constructing this really tightly woven thing that's maybe anticipating a lot of what we would otherwise want to, think about it, right? So in Library of Babel, for instance, there's like a list of texts that the library contains, which of course would contain all texts, in one of the texts, he's rifling off all these different examples, and one of them is just the true story of your death, right? And the Aleph has a similar thing. It's like it's this list of things that the narrator says in that he sees in the Aleph itself. He says, "I saw this, I saw that, I saw your face," right? So there's like the second person address, which um, in one sense, I guess it's easy to just understand that as addressing the reader, but I also think that even if there's like a fictional you that does something, right? There's someone being addressed that kind of gets us to see that there's some place outside of the very, not claustrophobic in like a horror way, but like the kind of sometimes really close together or claustrophobic spaces that Borges does. But of course, here it's a little different, right? So it's the he and the me, and I think that as much as we said that the horror is this kind of horror or this kind of darkness or I guess, truly obscurity of dementia. There's almost like a an attempt or an acknowledgement or something. I don't actually still know what to make of it, but the narrator is trying to actually understand like the difference between he and me in terms of his mother seeing him as like a separate person and maybe not recognizing him. And I still think this is like a question for me. I don't really have a good read on this ending, but I think it's an interesting kind of twist on what Borges does, and I'm not sure if this, you know, opens the story up or if it actually makes it a little more dark. I don't know. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, maybe just a final thought because we're running long
Yeah.
again. But I do think this perspectival sort of ambiguity between like between the first and third person, to me it actually maps on to this again fundamental question of temporality and sequence in narrative as such. And that also in turn maps on to that wonderful passage right in the beginning. And you could say that that's exactly what's going on with Tomorrow is Christmas, right? Or She Would Not Die Tomorrow. On the one hand, you could read it as I think the temporal sequential way of reading it would be to take the tomorrow seriously. So when we're reading a story or a novel, despite the past tense, and this is ultimately Kate Hamburger's point, despite the past tense, we're reading it as present. Like we immediately understand what tomorrow means. We inhabit the tomorrow as the future. We do not inhabit the tomorrow as the past. Um, and so to be immersed in the sort of contingent timeline of a life or of a story is to experience it in a linear fashion, you know, and that would also be to experience, in a way, as a storyteller, to be experiencing it as a me or first person, as the I who experiences in the moment, not as him or the person in the past, right? The prior version of myself. Because that's the striking thing about a first person narrative in particular, and this is one of them that the I is really two people. This is something narrative theorists have said for a long time. But the I is representing both the person telling the story now, right? That and then the I that experienced everything that happened, the I of the story world itself. And there is I said earlier that this whole story is emanating from that moment in the exhibit, right? But that would be the sequential understanding, the I understanding or the me understanding of the narrative, right? I'm reading despite the fact that it's manifestly like, clearly written in the past tense, so therefore can't be all emanating from that moment because that would be in the present tense,
Right.
right? Stream of consciousness. Um, I'm still reading it as unfolding live, as it were, dynamically, sequentially. But you could also read it as simultaneous, that is, as something frozen, something dead or finished and complete, right? That's being narrated from some future point in the past tense. And so we do, in a way, have to choose between which perspective we want to occupy or which perspective we want to prioritize. Um, Again, the fundamental paradox of narrative in many cases is that it seems to be like in word, we can contrast word form and content or word and deed, right? In word, in grammar, it's saying past tense is what matters. We should be thinking of this simultaneously, right? We should be thinking of this all as something finished, something that happened in the past that's being recounted now in the present. But we inhabit it and experience it, in fact, right? Indeed, often as something unfolding right now, something live, right? Something that's not dead, something that's not past, but actually something that has a real future where the future is uncertain. Um, and so, yeah, like I don't think that's precisely what's at stake, right? At in that final moment where the I and he sort of oscillate or bleed into each other. But it is again another striking sort of opposition that's both fundamental to what this story is doing and fundamental to these like larger questions of narrative, any kind of narrative, broadly speaking.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's actually a beautiful point to end on.
Cool. Well, let's wrap there. Hopefully more Sims in our future.
Yes.
But for now, Brian, especially in a dark exhibit, right? You want to see all those details of the fresco. Uh, you got to keep your magic lantern lit.
I will do. Thank you.